The collision of fate. The wail of the ambulance siren sliced through the quiet city streets, a sharp, urgent sound that reverberated in the hearts of everyone within earshot. Inside the vehicle, the atmosphere was tense. Dr. Ronan Carter, a 30-year-old black doctor, sat at the front, trying to focus on the task at hand. His colleague, Paramedic Lisa Hernandez, was in the back of the ambulance with their patient, a young woman in critical condition. The woman, a 30-year-old named Gianna, had been found just hours earlier on the edge of a bridge, where she had been attempting to take her own life. Ronan's mind raced as he glanced back toward the flashing lights of the police car blocking the intersection ahead. The ambulance had been sitting there for almost 5 minutes, unable to move, the seconds stretching into what felt like an eternity. He could feel the weight of time pressing down on him. Every second mattered when it came to saving a life. "Lisa, are you okay back there?" Ronan called out, trying to keep his voice steady. "We're holding steady for now," Lisa responded, her voice laced with tension but filled with determination. "But we need to get her to the hospital. Her vitals are all over the place." Ronan nodded, biting back the anxiety rising in his chest. He had seen too many lives teeter on the edge to let one slip away because of a delayed ambulance ride. He looked out the window, hoping the officer in the squad car would take notice and let them through, but there was no sign of movement from the vehicle. His patience was beginning to fray when, in a moment of haste, his foot accidentally pressed the gas pedal. The ambulance nudged forward, bumping gently into the back of the police car in front. Ronan's heart skipped a beat. Before he could even react, Officer Callan, a 45-year-old cop with a reputation for being both stern and aggressive, stormed out of his car. His face was twisted in anger, and his uniform seemed to accentuate the fury in his eyes. The air between them crackled with tension. "You have some nerve, don't you?" Officer Callan's voice was low, almost a growl. "Hitting a police car like that. You're going to regret this, you piece of trash." Ronan's hands were shaking as he quickly jumped out of the ambulance to try to explain. The last thing he needed right now was a confrontation, but the situation was quickly escalating. He tried to remain calm, taking a deep breath to steady himself. "Officer, please," Ronan said, raising his hands in a peaceful gesture. "We're responding to a medical emergency. We have to get to the hospital. Someone's life is on the line." But Officer Callan wasn't listening. He took a step closer, his towering frame casting a shadow over Ronan, his voice rising with every word. "Don't give me that excuse," Callan snapped. "I don't care about your so-called emergency. You hit a cop car, and that's a crime. People like you don't respect authority. I'll make sure you pay for this." Ronan's mind raced. He had encountered all kinds of situations in his career, disputes, challenges, life-or-death moments. But this was different. He wasn't prepared for this level of hostility, especially not with a patient in the back. With his heart pounding, Ronan tried again. "Please, you have to understand. There's a woman in the back of this ambulance who is in critical condition. If we don't get her to the hospital right now, she could die." Officer Callan wasn't moved. "I'm tired of your excuses," he sneered. "You think you can just do whatever you want because you're in an ambulance. No, that's not how this works." Ronan's frustration boiled over, but he managed to keep his cool, even though the adrenaline pumping through his veins urged him to do otherwise. He knew that if he didn't get this officer to understand the urgency of the situation, Gianna's chances of survival would grow slimmer by the second. Before he could say anything more, Callan's hand shot out, grabbing Ronan by the collar and yanking him up off his feet. The force of the action caused Ronan's breath to catch in his throat. "You think I'm playing with you?" Callan spat, shaking Ronan roughly. "You're gonna get a lesson in respect today, boy." Ronan's head reeled from the sudden motion, but he tried to focus, trying to block out the ringing in his ears and the rising panic in his chest. The weight of the situation wasn't lost on him. If Callan kept this up, they would waste more precious time that could cost Gianna her life. Just as the officer was about to drag Ronan away, a faint cry reached their ears. It was weak, but unmistakable. Both men turned at the same time, only to see a fragile figure stumbling out of the ambulance door. Gianna. Her face was pale, her hair disheveled, and she appeared barely conscious as she took one staggering step forward. Ronan's eyes widened in alarm, and he instinctively tried to move toward her, but Callan's grip on him tightened. "Let her go," Ronan shouted, trying to break free. But Callan just laughed, his hands tightening like a vice. "Look at her," Callan sneered. "She looks just fine to me." But before anyone could react, Gianna collapsed onto the street. Her body crumpled to the pavement with a sickening thud. Ronan's heart skipped a beat as he rushed toward her, finally breaking free from Callan's grip. "Get an ambulance here now," Ronan shouted, kneeling beside her. Callan watched in stunned silence as Ronan began performing CPR on the young woman, his hands pressing firmly against her chest in an effort to revive her. Every second felt like an eternity, but Ronan didn't stop. He couldn't afford to. As the paramedics arrived, Gianna was rushed back into the ambulance, and the police officer stood there, his face a mixture of confusion and begrudging respect. But there was something deeper in his expression, something that suggested he was beginning to question everything he thought he knew. Ronan climbed into the ambulance again, his hands still shaking from the adrenaline. He sat down in the front seat, staring ahead, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had managed to save her once again. But as the ambulance sped toward the hospital, Ronan couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. The awakening of a new hope. The flashing red and blue lights of the ambulance bounced off the streets, blurring into a dizzying rhythm as the vehicle sped through the city. Dr. Ronan Carter's heart was still pounding from the chaos of the earlier confrontation, but his focus had returned to the task at hand. Gianna was the only thing that mattered now. Her pulse had been weak when they first found her. The paramedics had managed to stabilize her just enough for transport, but even in that fragile state, she was still fighting. Ronan couldn't help but admire her resilience, even as the weight of her near-death experience hung heavy in the air. He glanced back at Lisa, who was doing everything she could to keep Gianna stable. The young woman was still unconscious, her breath shallow and labored, but there was a faint flicker of life in her eyes every time her chest rose and fell. Ronan wiped the sweat from his brow, knowing that they still had miles to go before they reached the hospital. Every second mattered. He could feel the pressure mounting as the clock ticked relentlessly forward. "This is getting dangerous," Lisa muttered, her voice tense. "We're not going to make it if we don't pick up the pace." Ronan didn't need to be told twice. He shifted into overdrive, pushing the ambulance through the streets, carefully weaving through traffic as fast as the law allowed. In his mind, he was already calculating every possible outcome. How long they had before Gianna's condition became critical, what steps they'd need to take once they arrived at the hospital, and most importantly, how to get through the trauma she had just survived. Her story wasn't just a simple case of an attempted suicide. It was the culmination of years of pain, loneliness, and despair. Ronan had seen it before, the darkness that lingered in the corners of people's souls, but there was something about Gianna's case that tugged at his heart. He could sense it. There was a deeper connection between her and the struggle he had always fought in his own life, the struggle to overcome personal demons, to fight for a better tomorrow, and to find hope in the darkest of places. The ambulance arrived at the hospital with screeching tires, the sound of the engine turning off echoing in the sterile hallway. Ronan rushed out of the vehicle as quickly as he could, his hands moving expertly as he assisted the hospital team in transferring Gianna onto a gurney. As they rushed her inside, Ronan's mind remained focused, but his heart ached. What had driven Gianna to this point? What had caused her to stand on that bridge in the first place? Inside the ICU, the machines beeped rhythmically, a cold reminder of the fine line between life and death. Ronan stood at the foot of Gianna's bed, watching as doctors and nurses worked in unison to stabilize her condition. Her vitals were still erratic, her body too weak to fully recover from the trauma she had endured, but there was a glimmer of hope. Her pulse was strong enough to survive, her breathing shallow but steady. As the hours dragged on, Ronan remained by her side, not ready to leave. The trauma she had endured wasn't just physical, it was emotional, spiritual, and psychological. He knew that Gianna would need more than just medical treatment to heal. She would need someone to show her that life was worth living, that she could find a way out of the darkness. But the weight of the question lingered in his mind. What had brought her to the brink? Hours later, Gianna awakes. The fluorescent lights flickered above, their sterile hum filling the otherwise quiet room. Ronan was sitting in a chair beside Gianna's bed, his eyes bloodshot from the long night he had spent awake. He hadn't been able to sleep. The thoughts of that fateful moment on the bridge, the anger from Officer Callan, and the desperation in Gianna's eyes kept him alert. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her, on the edge of that bridge, ready to give up. It was only when the soft sound of a breath broke the stillness that Ronan's focus snapped back to the present. He blinked, unsure at first whether it was a trick of his mind. But then he saw it. Gianna's fingers twitching slightly, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. "She's waking up," Ronan murmured under his breath, rising from his seat and moving closer to her side. Gianna's eyelids fluttered, and with a faint groan, she slowly opened her eyes. The bright hospital lights made her squint, but she quickly adjusted. The disorientation in her expression was palpable, her brow furrowing as she took in her surroundings. "Where am I?" she whispered hoarsely, her voice weak and fragile. "You're in the hospital," Ronan replied softly, his voice reassuring yet firm. "You were brought in after an incident, but you're safe now. You're going to be okay." Gianna's gaze darted around the room, trying to make sense of everything. Her mind raced. The last thing she remembered was standing on the bridge, staring at the dark water below, feeling the crushing weight of everything that had led her to that moment. The pain, the loneliness, the overwhelming sense of failure. Tears welled up in her eyes as memories of her last moments before the attempt flooded her mind. But instead of sinking into despair, something in her stirred. Something shifted. She turned her eyes back to Ronan. He was there, standing in front of her, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the whirlwind of thoughts raging inside her. He was a stranger, yet somehow his presence felt like the anchor she desperately needed. "I don't deserve to be here," Gianna whispered, her voice barely audible. Ronan sat down next to her, his eyes soft but full of understanding. "Everyone deserves a second chance, Gianna. Even when it doesn't feel like it, even when the world feels too heavy, there's always a reason to keep fighting. You're not alone in this. No matter what you've gone through, you're not alone anymore." For a long moment, Gianna stared at him, her mind struggling to process his words. She didn't understand it all, but there was something about his unwavering conviction that made her believe him. Maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong about everything. Maybe it wasn't too late for her to change. Ronan didn't know what the future held for Gianna. He didn't know if she would walk away from this encounter with a renewed sense of purpose, or if the darkness would pull her back into its grip. But what he did know, with absolute certainty, was that every person had the potential to rise above their past, to make a difference, to find hope where none seemed possible. And he was going to be there, every step of the way, to help her find that hope again. The unseen struggle. The days that followed Gianna's awakening were a blur of uncertainty and hope. Dr. Ronan Carter had spent every moment he could at her bedside, checking in on her condition, offering encouragement, and gently coaxing her to open up about what had led her to the edge. But Gianna remained distant, locked inside her thoughts, as if her mind was a fortress he wasn't quite ready to let anyone enter. In the sterile, white room where Gianna lay, the sounds of beeping machines and the steady rustling of nurses moving about were the only things that broke the silence. Ronan had learned to read her silent cues, when she was ready to talk, when she withdrew into herself, and when she simply needed someone to be there. He could feel the weight of the unspoken words between them. Gianna had yet to tell him the full story of her life, the events that had pushed her to such a desperate point. But Ronan was patient. He knew that healing wasn't a quick process. It was a slow, sometimes painful journey that couldn't be rushed. One morning, after Gianna had been moved to a regular hospital room, Ronan was once again by her side. He had been looking over her medical charts, reviewing her progress, when he noticed the slight change in her demeanor. Her eyes, once clouded with a mix of sadness and uncertainty, were clearer now. There was a flicker of something else, something deeper, though still hidden beneath layers of fear and doubt. "How are you feeling today?" Ronan asked gently, setting aside the chart to focus on her. Gianna's eyes darted away, her fingers absently tracing the edge of the hospital blanket. She was quiet for a moment, as if weighing whether or not to answer. Finally, she sighed, her voice soft and almost imperceptible. "I don't know. Everything feels so heavy, like there's no way out, no way forward." Ronan took a seat beside her bed, his eyes soft with empathy. "I can't pretend to know what you're going through, but I do know this. You're still here. You made it through. That means there's something inside you that's fighting for your life, no matter how hard it feels right now." Gianna turned her head to look at him, her gaze searching his face for any hint of insincerity, but all she found was honesty. He wasn't just saying words to fill the silence. He believed what he was saying. She couldn't deny the sincerity in his voice. "Why do you care?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm just a mess. I don't know how to move past this." Ronan's expression softened. "It's not about fixing things or pretending everything is okay," he said, leaning forward slightly. "It's about walking through the darkness, one step at a time. And sometimes having someone to walk with you can make all the difference." There was a long pause as Gianna processed his words. She wasn't ready to talk yet, not about the past, not about the pain, but there was a seed of something stirring inside her, a tiny spark of curiosity, of hope, that maybe she wasn't alone in this world. Flashback to Gianna's life. The quiet moments spent with Gianna were becoming more frequent, but Ronan was still unaware of the full extent of her pain. He only knew bits and pieces of her life, her failed relationships, the feeling of never quite measuring up, the isolation that had slowly suffocated her until the moment she stepped onto that bridge. But Gianna's past was a labyrinth of emotions she wasn't ready to face head-on. She wasn't ready to let anyone into the deepest parts of her soul. She knew there were people who cared about her. Her family, some friends, but there had always been an invisible wall between them and her true self, a wall she had built brick by brick out of shame, guilt, and the constant feeling that she didn't belong. As a child, Gianna had been raised in a home that wasn't filled with love, but rather with unspoken expectations. Her parents were well-intentioned but distant, their idea of affection rooted in achievement. Grades, success, and accomplishments were the only ways to gain their approval. But no matter how hard she tried, no matter how many accolades she earned, it never felt enough. They were always looking for more, always pushing her to be something she wasn't. When Gianna left for college, she thought she would finally break free from the suffocating grasp of her parents' expectations. But it was there, in the loneliness of a new city, that the cracks in her facade began to show. She was surrounded by people but felt more isolated than ever. She hid behind the mask of a confident, independent woman, but inside, she was falling apart. It wasn't long before Gianna's mental health began to deteriorate. Anxiety and depression took hold of her, gnawing at her from within. She turned to unhealthy coping mechanisms, alcohol, toxic relationships, and numbing herself with distractions. Every attempt to escape her pain only deepened the wounds. When Gianna met Kevin, a charming but emotionally unavailable man, she thought she had finally found someone who could see her, someone who could fill the void. But instead, Kevin used her vulnerability as leverage to manipulate her. The relationship became a battlefield of unmet needs and emotional abuse, leaving Gianna feeling even more worthless than before. Eventually, the weight of everything, her past, her present, the lies, the broken relationships, became too much to bear. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't see a way out. And that was when she found herself standing on the edge of that bridge, her mind swirling with hopeless thoughts. The only thing she could think was that it would be easier to disappear than to continue living in a world that felt so unbearably cold. But fate had intervened in the form of Dr. Ronan Carter. He had been the one to pull her back from the brink, the one to remind her that even in her darkest moments, she still had value, that there was still a future worth fighting for. Gianna's turning point. It was early the next morning when Gianna's perspective started to shift. She had been lying awake, her thoughts racing, when she felt something, a strange, unfamiliar sense of clarity. For the first time in a long while, she realized that she didn't have to carry the weight of her past alone. She didn't have to hold on to the pain, the shame, or the guilt anymore. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy. Healing never was. But Gianna understood now that it was possible. She could rebuild her life, piece by piece, with the help of the people who cared about her. Roman's words echoed in her mind. "You're not alone in this." Gianna's resolve was still fragile, like a freshly sprouted seed in the spring. But it was there. The desire to heal, to live, to find peace within herself. As she lay there in the quiet of the hospital room, she allowed herself a moment to feel something new, a glimmer of hope, a tiny flicker of the future she could create. And for the first time in years, Gianna allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she was worthy of it. A path toward healing. The days following Gianna's awakening were a mixture of physical recovery and emotional unraveling. Each morning, as the soft rays of sunlight filtered through the hospital window, she woke up to a new reality. A reality where she wasn't alone, where people cared about her, and where there was hope. But the road ahead was still uncertain, the weight of her past lingering in the background like a storm cloud, ready to burst. Dr. Ronan Carter remained by her side, a constant, reassuring presence. He had seen countless patients through their darkest times, but something about Gianna's story resonated deeply with him. She was a reflection of so many others who had been crushed under the weight of expectations, who had fought to keep up appearances while silently suffering on the inside. It wasn't just Gianna's struggle that touched him. It was her strength. In the face of unimaginable pain, she had still found the will to survive. That, Ronan knew, was the key to healing, and it was why he had never once given up on her. He didn't see her as a broken soul. He saw someone who was ready to rebuild, if only she could believe in herself again. The turning point. As the week passed, Gianna's body healed, slowly but surely. The doctors were impressed by her recovery. Her wounds were minimal, and her physical condition was improving every day. But it was the emotional scars, the silent ones, that would take time to heal. Gianna knew this, and for the first time in a long while, she was willing to confront them. One afternoon, as Ronan sat with her in her room, he noticed a subtle change in her demeanor. She wasn't withdrawn or distant, as she had been before. Instead, she was sitting up in her bed, her eyes thoughtful as she looked out the window, staring at the world beyond. "Ronan," she said, her voice steady but soft, "I think I'm ready to talk." Ronan's heart skipped a beat. For days, he had waited for this moment. The moment when Gianna would decide to open up. "You don't have to do it if you're not ready," he said gently. "But I'm here for you, no matter what." Gianna met his gaze, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. I think I've been running from my own truth for too long." Roman's presence seemed to give her courage, as if his quiet support was a lifeline she could cling to. She took a deep breath before continuing. The story of Gianna's struggle. "I don't remember when it all started," Gianna began, her voice shaky but resolute. "Maybe it was when I was a little girl. My parents, they were good people, but they were always so focused on achievement. I was never enough, no matter how hard I tried. When I brought home straight A's, They just expected it. They'd never celebrate it, never tell me they were proud. It was like I had to be perfect to be loved. Gianna paused, her eyes clouding over as the memories washed over her. Ronan could see the pain on her face, the years of repression, and the unspoken weight she carried. But he remained silent, waiting for her to continue. I thought that if I could just be perfect, if I could prove myself, I'd finally earn their love. But nothing worked. I always felt like there was something wrong with me. I wasn't good enough. I didn't have the right friends, the right personality, the right interests. There was always someone better, someone smarter, someone more successful. Tears welled up in Gianna's eyes, but she didn't look away. She let the vulnerability in, for the first time in years. I thought if I could be the best at something, anything, then maybe they would finally see me. But it didn't matter. Nothing was ever enough. Her voice cracked. I never felt like I was really seen. It was like I was invisible, even to the people who were supposed to love me the most. Ronan watched her, his heart aching for her. He could understand her feelings, even if he hadn't experienced them exactly the same way. The pressure to be something you're not, the internal battle to prove your worth, it was a struggle that many carried silently. I tried so hard to keep up appearances. Gianna continued, her voice growing more confident as she spoke. In college, I started drinking. It was the only thing that made me feel like I could escape for a little while. But it wasn't long before I fell into toxic relationships. I met Kevin. He seemed like the one person who could love me for who I was. But it turns out I was wrong. He used me, Ronan. I let him use me. I let him tear me down until I couldn't recognize myself anymore. Gianna's voice faltered, but she pressed on. I thought I'd never be free. I thought I would always be stuck in this cycle of self-doubt and pain. That's when I thought, maybe the only way out was to end it, to just disappear. I couldn't take it anymore. She closed her eyes, her tears falling freely now. But then you showed up. You were there when I needed someone the most. You saved me, Ronan. Ronan was quiet for a long moment, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. Gianna had been carrying this pain alone for so long, and now she was finally allowing herself to be seen. It was a breakthrough, a step toward healing. Thank you for trusting me with your story, Ronan said softly. I know it's not easy, but it's the first step toward freeing yourself from the past. You're not what happened to you, Gianna. You are not defined by your mistakes or your pain. A new beginning. Over the next few weeks, Gianna began to change. Slowly, she found the courage to attend therapy sessions, guided by a compassionate counselor who helped her unravel the layers of pain she had buried for so long. Every session was a challenge, but it was also a step forward. Gianna was learning to confront her past, to accept it, and most importantly, to forgive herself. Ronan continued to support her, offering encouragement and guidance whenever she needed it. He didn't try to fix her or offer easy solutions. He simply listened and let her know that, no matter how dark her world seemed, she wasn't alone. One evening, as Gianna sat in the park near the hospital, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't completely healed, but for the first time, she felt hopeful. The weight of her past was still there, but it no longer had the power to define her. She had a future now, a future where she could find joy again, where she could build a life beyond her pain. It wouldn't be perfect, and there would still be struggles ahead, but Gianna finally believed in the possibility of change. And as she walked back to the hospital, her heart a little lighter, she knew that this was just the beginning of her journey. The road to rediscovery. The days following Gianna's breakthrough were filled with quiet victories. Each morning, she woke up with a little more strength than the day before, the weight of her past slowly lifting as she confronted each memory, each regret, with a new perspective. It wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, times when the darkness tried to pull her back. But Gianna was learning to fight back. With the steady support of Dr. Ronan Carter and her therapist, Gianna had begun the slow, painful process of rediscovery. It was a journey that demanded patience, honesty, and most of all, the courage to face the parts of herself that she had hidden for so long. There were days when she wondered if she could ever be whole again, days when she questioned whether she was strong enough to continue. But those days were becoming fewer and farther between, replaced by moments of clarity, of hope, and, for the first time in years, a belief that maybe, just maybe, she was worthy of happiness. A new beginning. One afternoon, as the hospital room door swung open, Gianna looked up from the book she had been reading. It was Ronan, with his familiar smile and easygoing demeanor. He had been a constant presence since the day he had saved her. And now, as she stood on the precipice of healing, he was still there, offering support without judgment. "How's the book?" Ronan asked, leaning against the doorframe. Gianna smiled faintly, marking her page. "It's good. Really good. It's about finding yourself after losing everything." Ronan raised an eyebrow. "Sounds like something you could relate to." She laughed softly, the sound lighter than it had been in weeks. "I suppose it is." Ronan took a few steps into the room, his hands in his pockets. "You know, we've been talking about everything you've been through, but we haven't really talked about what comes next. What do you want for your future, Gianna?" The question hung in the air, unexpected and profound. Gianna hadn't really thought about her future beyond the hospital walls. She'd been so focused on survival, on putting one foot in front of the other, that the concept of a life outside the shadow of her past had felt out of reach. But now, with Ronan's words, the door to that possibility opened just a little wider. "I haven't really figured it out," Gianna admitted, the honesty in her voice a sign of just how far she had come. "But I know I want something different. I want to live, really live, without constantly looking over my shoulder at what I've been through." Ronan nodded, a look of understanding in his eyes. "That's a good start. It's not easy to let go of everything you've carried for so long, but the fact that you're thinking about the future means you're already moving forward." Gianna looked out the window, watching the cars pass by, the world outside moving at its usual pace. For a moment, she let herself dream. Maybe she could go back to school, finish her degree that had been put on hold years ago. Maybe she could travel, see the world, experience life in a way she never had before. Maybe she could help others who were struggling, just like she had been. The possibilities were vast, and for the first time, she could see them. "I've always wanted to help people," she said, turning back to Ronan. "Maybe I could work with mental health organizations or counseling. There's so much I wish I had known before, so much I wish someone had told me when I was struggling." Ronan smiled, his eyes lighting up at her words. "I think that's a wonderful idea, Gianna. You have a unique perspective on things. You've been through it, and now you have the ability to guide others through their own struggles." Gianna felt a flicker of excitement deep inside her, a warmth that spread through her chest. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she had a purpose, like there was something she could give to the world that mattered. Confronting the past. But the road to rediscovery was not without its challenges. Gianna knew that, despite the progress she had made, there were still demons to face. There was still the painful task of confronting the people who had hurt her in the past, her parents, Kevin, and even herself. Healing wasn't just about moving forward. It was about understanding the past and finding peace with it. One afternoon, while Ronan was on a break, Gianna decided it was time to face her parents. It had been years since they had spoken openly, their relationship strained by unspoken words and unmet expectations. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but if she was ever going to truly heal, she needed to make peace with them. Sitting in the waiting room of the hospital, she took a deep breath before dialing their number. Her hands were shaking, her heart racing. It had been so long since she had allowed herself to be vulnerable with them, but she knew it was time to break down the walls that had kept them all distant for so long. "Hello," her mother's voice came through the phone, tentative and unsure. "Mom, it's me," Gianna said, her voice trembling. "I know it's been a long time, and I don't know where to even start, but I think I need to talk." There was a long silence on the other end. Gianna could hear her mother's breath catch, could almost feel the weight of the years pressing in on them both. "What is it, sweetheart?" her mother finally asked, her voice softer now, more open. "I've been thinking about everything," Gianna began, the words coming slowly at first. "I've been thinking about how we've never really talked about why things fell apart between us, and I realized something. I've been carrying so much anger and pain for years, and it's hurt me more than it's hurt you." Her mother's voice softened. "I never wanted to hurt you, Gianna. I know I made mistakes, but I thought I was doing what was best. I didn't realize how hard I was on you until it was too late." Gianna let out a breath she hadn't known she had been holding. "I think we both missed a lot of chances to understand each other. I want us to move forward, Mom. I want to find a way to have a relationship that isn't based on expectations, but on love." The conversation lasted for an hour, and by the time it ended, Gianna felt lighter than she had in years. It wasn't perfect, and there was still work to be done. But for the first time, she felt like she had opened a door to healing. She wasn't ready to forget everything, but she was ready to forgive. And that, Gianna realized, was the key to unlocking her future. The first steps forward. With her parents' relationship tentatively on the mend, Gianna found herself stepping into a new chapter of her life. It wasn't without its struggles, but each day brought a new opportunity for growth and discovery. She continued therapy, worked on rebuilding her self-esteem, and focused on the small steps that would lead her to a brighter future. Ronan remained by her side, though he no longer had to be there every day. Gianna was learning to navigate life on her own, no longer relying on the crutch of her past to define her. It wasn't easy. She stumbled, she faltered, but each time, she got back up, determined to keep moving forward. And as she looked out at the world around her, Gianna realized something incredible. She had a future she had built for herself, from the ashes of her past, and it was filled with endless possibilities. Embracing the future, the cool autumn air brushed against Gianna's face as she stepped outside the hospital for the first time in weeks. The world seemed brighter, less oppressive, as if the weight she had carried for so long was finally beginning to lift. Each step she took felt like a victory. Each breath she inhaled felt like a promise of something better. It had been a long road, but Gianna was finally beginning to see the light. The struggle to confront her past, to heal from the emotional wounds that had held her hostage for so long, had been grueling. But now, standing at the threshold of a new chapter, Gianna felt a renewed sense of purpose, a sense of freedom she had never known before. A new life. Over the last few months, Gianna had slowly started to rebuild her life. She had started volunteering at a local mental health organization, using her experience to help others who were struggling. There, she found a deep sense of fulfillment that came from connecting with people who were facing similar battles. It was humbling, and it reminded her that no one had to face their pain alone. Every time she shared her story, she saw the impact it had on those who were listening. The same faces she had once seen in the mirror, filled with uncertainty and fear. She had become a beacon of hope, proof that it was possible to overcome even the darkest of times. And that felt powerful. Gianna had also started going back to school, picking up the pieces of her education that had been lost during the years of her struggle. It wasn't easy. Balancing her work at the mental health center with her studies was a challenge, but it was a challenge she welcomed. It was a challenge that gave her life direction. At night, after a long day of helping others, Gianna would sit at her desk, her books spread out in front of her, and think about how far she had come. There had been a time when she had doubted her ability to change, to rebuild herself. But now, as she focused on the future she was creating, Gianna saw a path unfolding in front of her, a path that was hers to walk. Rebuilding relationships. One of the hardest steps in Gianna's journey had been mending her relationships with the people who had been part of her past. There was the difficult task of reconnecting with her parents, whose expectations and emotional distance had played such a big role in her suffering. But there was also the matter of Kevin. her ex, the man who had once been the source of so much pain in her life. Gianna had decided that, to truly heal, she needed to make peace with Kevin. Not to go back to the toxic relationship they had once shared, but to find closure. It was something she knew deep down that she couldn't move forward without. So, after weeks of reflection, she reached out to him, nervously typing out a message and hitting send before she could second-guess herself. The reply came a few days later, and it was short, but it was enough. "Maybe we could talk," Kevin wrote. When they met in a quiet cafe on a crisp afternoon, the conversation was difficult at first. Kevin apologized, but it felt more like a formality than a genuine reflection of the damage he had caused. But for Gianna, the most important part of the conversation wasn't what he said. It was that she said her piece. She told him how much his actions had hurt her, how his manipulation and emotional neglect had left her questioning her own worth. Kevin listened, but it was clear that he hadn't fully grasped the extent of his actions. That was okay, though. What mattered was that Gianna had found the strength to speak her truth, to take back the power she had once given away. The conversation didn't end with a resolution or rekindled friendship, but that wasn't the point. It was about taking control of her own narrative. For the first time in years, Gianna realized that she didn't need anyone else to validate her worth. She was enough, just as she was. The road ahead. While Gianna's emotional healing had been steady, she knew the work wasn't over. She would always carry the lessons from her past with her, but they no longer defined her. Her past had shaped her, yes, but it no longer held power over her. There were moments when Gianna still found herself battling doubt, moments when the old fears crept back in, reminding her of the darkness she had once known so well. But she had learned to recognize those moments, to acknowledge them without letting them consume her. She was stronger now, wiser, and more capable than she had ever been before. One evening, as Gianna sat on the balcony of her small apartment, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she thought about everything she had gone through. The pain, the loneliness, the moments when she had felt like giving up. But now, as she looked out over the city, she felt a sense of peace. It was the kind of peace that came from knowing she had made it through, that she had survived. And with that peace came the understanding that life wasn't about avoiding pain. It was about learning to live with it, to use it as a catalyst for growth. It was about building something new, even after everything had fallen apart. A moment of reflection. The following week, Gianna sat down at her desk to finish an assignment for her mental health counseling program. It was a paper on the importance of resilience, and as she wrote, she reflected on her own journey. She had written countless essays in the past, but this one felt different. This one was personal. It was her story, one of falling down, but also of getting back up. She paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, and thought for a moment about the lessons she had learned. Self-worth. It wasn't until she learned to love herself that she was able to truly heal. She had spent so many years seeking validation from others, but now she understood that true healing came from within. Forgiveness, not just for others, but for herself. She had to forgive herself for the mistakes she had made, for the times she had let herself be hurt, and for the choices she had made when she didn't know how to protect her heart. Hope. No matter how dark the world seemed, there was always a reason to keep moving forward. She had learned that hope was the spark that ignited change, and it was something she would never let go of again. Courage. The courage to face her past, the courage to embrace the future, and the courage to take that first step toward healing, no matter how difficult it might seem. As Gianna finished the paper and hit submit, she felt a sense of pride in her work, but more importantly, she felt a sense of pride in herself. She was no longer the woman who had stood on that bridge, ready to give up. She was no longer defined by the pain of her past. She was defined by her strength, by the resilience she had found within herself. And that, she knew, was only the beginning. The future is hers. In the weeks that followed, Gianna found herself stepping into the world with new eyes. The future no longer seemed like a daunting, unreachable place. It was a canvas, and she was the artist, ready to paint a life that was vibrant, full of purpose, and grounded in the lessons she had learned along the way. Gianna had made it through the hardest part of her journey, but she knew the road ahead would continue to require courage, self-compassion, and the determination to face whatever challenges life threw her way. But for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of the future. The woman she had once been, the woman who felt invisible, unworthy, and alone, was no longer in control. The woman she was becoming, the one who had found her voice, her strength, and her hope, was the woman who would lead her forward. And as she walked toward that future, she knew she wasn't alone. She had herself, and that was enough.